I still remember the sound of Michael's car pulling into the driveway 3 days after our father's funeral. Not the soft hum of someone arriving to grieve. This was the confident roar of someone who had already won. When Michael walked through that door, he didn't knock. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't even look at me with anything resembling sympathy. He looked at me the way he'd always looked at me, like I was an obstacle, a footnote, something to step over on his way to what he believed he deserved. "Daniel," he said, my name sharp and cold in his mouth. "We need to talk." He pulled a thick manila envelope from under his arm and dropped it on the kitchen table between us. The sound it made, that heavy, final thud, felt like the closing of a door I would never be able to open again. "The will was read this morning," Michael continued, his voice calm, controlled, satisfied. "Dad left everything to me, the house, the investments, the savings accounts, all of it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, holding the coffee mug I had picked up without realizing it, feeling the ceramic cool slowly against my palms. "You have 1 hour," he said, glancing at his watch. "Pack what you need, leave your keys on the counter. And Daniel," he paused just long enough to enjoy the silence, then smiled, "don't make this harder than it has to be." My name is Daniel Carson, and for 32 years I have been the invisible son. Not in the visible in the way some children are neglected or abandoned. My invisibility was quieter than that, more precise. I was seen just enough to be useful, acknowledged just enough to be obligated, loved just enough to keep hoping that someday it might finally be enough. I'm a financial analyst by profession. Numbers, patterns, details, these are the languages I speak, fluently. I notice what others miss. I read the fine print. I plan for contingencies. Perhaps that's why I became what I became in our family. The responsible one, the reliable one, the son who stayed close while my brother chased dreams funded by our father's checkbook. I lived in a modest apartment 15 minutes from our childhood home, close enough to help and far enough to pretend I had my own life. But the truth is, my life had always orbited around that house, around Dad, around the quiet hope that maybe if I just did enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, I would finally be seen the way Michael was seen. I was wrong. Growing up, Michael was untouchable. He was the golden child, the chosen one, the son who could do no wrong even when he did everything wrong. When Michael failed his college entrance exams, our father hired a private tutor and paid for a second chance. When I graduated at the top of my class, Dad nodded once and asked if I had remembered to thank my teachers. When Michael wrecked his first car, drunk and reckless, endangering everyone around him, our father bought him a new one and lectured me about being judgmental when I dared suggest that consequences might help. When I worked 3 jobs to pay for my own education, Dad called it good practice for the real world. Michael got praise, I got expectations. Michael got forgiveness, I got silence. Michael got love, loud and unquestioned, and I got the responsibility of pretending that was fair. Michael is 2 years older than me, but he never felt like an older brother. Older brothers protect, guide, stand beside you. Michael stood above me, always looking down, always reminding me in ways both subtle and obvious that he was the heir and I was whatever was left over. He's handsome in that effortless way some people are. Tall, confident, with our father's strong jaw and our mother's dark eyes. He knows how to work a room, how to make people believe in him even when there's nothing beneath the surface worth believing in. I look like our mother too, but in quieter ways. The same eyes, but always watching instead of commanding. The same features, softened by years of swallowing words I should have spoken. People always liked Michael more. He was charming where I was careful,
bold where I was thoughtful. He made people feel good about themselves, even as he was using them. I made people uncomfortable, I think, because I noticed things, because I asked questions, because I didn't let charm substitute for substance. I was the one who stayed. When our mother died, Michael flew in for the funeral, stayed 2 days, and left before the reception ended. I was the one who held our father's hand through his grief, the one who organized her belongings, the one who sat with him in the quiet evenings when the house felt too big and too empty. When Dad's health started failing, Michael sent a card from Europe, where he was finding himself, with our father's money funding the journey. I was the one who drove Dad to doctor's appointments, filled his prescriptions, cooked his meals, and made sure he wasn't alone. When the medical bills started piling up, I helped him pay them. I drained my savings account twice to cover treatments insurance wouldn't approve. I took a second mortgage on my own small apartment to afford the in-home care he needed. Michael called once a month, sometimes. Always brief, always distant, always with an excuse about why he couldn't visit. "Work's crazy right now, Dan, you understand." I understood perfectly. In the final weeks, when Dad could barely speak, I sat beside his bed and read to him. Old books he loved, articles from the paper, stories that made him smile during those brief moments of clarity. I was there for the silences, too, the long stretches where all I could do was hold his hand and listen to his breathing. One night, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice thin and fractured, "you've always been the strong one." I wanted to ask what that meant. I wanted to ask if being strong meant being invisible, if being dependable meant being disposable. But I didn't. I just held his hand and told him I loved him. 2 days later, he was gone. Michael didn't cry at the funeral. He stood beside me in his expensive black suit, shaking hands with people who barely knew our father, accepting condolences with practiced grace. When it was over, when the last guest had left and the flowers were wilting in their vases, Michael pulled me aside. "We'll need to settle the estate," he said, already moving past grief into logistics. "I'll handle everything. Don't worry about it." I should have known then. I should have seen it. But I was tired, hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, so I nodded, and Michael smiled. 3 days later, he came back with that envelope. 1 hour to leave. I packed slowly, methodically. Every item I placed in boxes felt like a small surrender. Photographs of birthdays Michael had missed, books our father had given me, the quilt our mother made before she died. Michael watched from the doorway, checking his watch, impatient even in his victory. "You know this isn't personal, Dan," he said, his tone almost gentle, almost convincing. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw what he'd always been. Not my brother, not family, just a stranger wearing a familiar face, a man who measured love in assets and worth in dollar signs. "Of course," I said quietly, "nothing ever is with you." He frowned, not quite understanding, not quite caring enough to ask. When I walked out of that house for what I thought might be the last time, I didn't look back. Michael locked the door behind me, and the sound of that deadbolt sliding into place echoed in a way I knew I'd never forget. I moved into a small rental across town, a one-bedroom place that felt more temporary than real. Barely furnished, barely lived in. I should have been devastated, broken, defeated by the speed with which my life had been dismantled. But I wasn't. Because 3 days before our father died, He had asked to speak to me alone. The hospice nurse stepped out. Michael was, as usual, absent, and Dad, with effort that clearly cost him more than he wanted to admit, pulled a single document from beneath his pillow. "Page 5, he whispered, pressing it into my hands. "Read page 5. His eyes held mine with an intensity I hadn't seen in months. "Trust me," he breathed. "Michael never reads the fine print." I didn't read it that night. I couldn't. I folded the document carefully and tucked it away, telling myself I'd look at it later, when the grief wasn't so fresh and I could think clearly. But then the funeral happened, and Michael's ambush, and the 1-hour eviction. It wasn't until I was sitting on the floor of that empty rental apartment, surrounded by boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack, that I finally unfolded the document. It was the will, a copy annotated in our father's shaking handwriting. And there, on page 5, buried in dense legal language that Michael's arrogance had made him skip, was the first clue. I read it once, then again, and then a third time before the meaning began to sink in. The house wasn't a gift. It wasn't even a reward. It was a transfer of ownership wrapped in conditions, layered so carefully that only someone willing to read every word would understand what it truly meant. The first condition seemed almost harmless. All outstanding debts associated with the property transferred with ownership. I opened my laptop and searched public property records, and there it was, staring back at me from the screen, the second mortgage our father had taken out 2 years earlier, a substantial loan Michael had never known about because he had never asked about Dad's finances. I sat back slowly, my heart pounding. This alone would be enough to shake Michael's confidence. But something told me not to stop reading. That instinct was right. Condition 2 was buried deeper in the document, written in language designed to discourage anyone skimming for headlines instead of meaning. The inheritor assumed full financial responsibility for all medical bills incurred during the final 18 months of our father's life. Every hospital visit, every treatment, every medication, every hour of in-home care. Bills that totaled more than the house was worth. Bills I had already paid. My hands began to shake as the implications settled in. This wasn't just a poorly thought-out inheritance. This was a trap, carefully constructed, patiently waiting for the right person to walk into it. And there was more. Condition 3 appeared several paragraphs later, almost as an afterthought. The transfer of ownership was contingent upon the inheritor maintaining possession of the property for a minimum of 5 years. Any attempt to sell, transfer, or leverage the property before that period ended would trigger immediate forfeiture. The house would revert to the secondary beneficiary, me. I stood up and paced the small apartment, reading the clause again and again, making sure grief hadn't distorted my understanding. It was airtight, precise, unforgiving. Our father had built this layer by layer, each condition forcing Michael deeper into a hole he didn't even know existed. But condition 4 was the masterpiece. All investment accounts listed in the will were not direct inheritances at all. They were trust funds governed by strict disbursement schedules tied to documented family contributions during our father's final years. Contributions Michael had never made. contributions I had tracked, documented, and preserved at our father's insistence. The money Michael believed he had inherited was already mine, legally, irrevocably. Our father gave Michael exactly what he always wanted, the appearance of victory. And he gave me what I had actually earned. Everything real. I sat on the floor of that empty apartment, reading and rereading page 5 until the words began to blur. And then I laughed. Not a happy laugh, not a triumphant one. It was hollow, unsteady, tasting of grief and something that felt dangerously close to relief. Our father had seen everything. He had known exactly who Michael was, exactly who I was, and exactly what each of us would do when placed in the same position. He had crafted his final act accordingly. I didn't call Michael. I didn't contact his lawyer. I didn't confront anyone or ask for explanations. I simply waited. Because I knew Michael. I knew his patterns, his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he was always the smartest person in the room. He would discover the truth on his own, and when he did, the fall would be far worse than anything I could have engineered myself. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Michael posting photos on social media of his house. 6 weeks of parties, renovations he bragged about but never finished, and public declarations that he had finally gotten what he deserved. 6 weeks of confidence built on an assumption he had never bothered to verify. And then the bills began to arrive. The first was the mortgage payment, larger than Michael expected because he had never asked about refinancing, never inquired about the terms, never looked beyond the word ownership to understand what that word actually cost. Then came the medical bills. Collections agencies I had already settled with sent formal notices of transferred liability, their totals dwarfing the value of the house itself. Then came the reassessment notices, property taxes, insurance premiums, maintenance costs for a house Michael never maintained and never planned to keep long enough to care about. I know this because our father's estate attorney, now my attorney as well, kept me informed. Every registered letter, every legal notice, every panicked phone call Michael made as the weight of reality began to press down on him. He thinks there's been a mistake, the attorney told me during one of our calls. I said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him to read page 5. A week later, the attorney called again. "Your brother just took out a personal loan, high interest. He's trying to cover the bills without selling." I wasn't surprised. When Michael encountered consequences, he didn't adjust, he doubled down. He's also talking online about investment opportunities, renovating, flipping the property. I almost laughed. Michael still believed he was winning. He had no idea the trap had already closed.
Michael called me the first time 2 months after he had evicted me from our childhood home. I let it go to voicemail. He called again and again, each message more frantic than the last. "Dan, there's been some kind of error with the will. Daniel, I need you to explain what the lawyer is saying. Daniel, please, I think Dad made a mistake." I deleted every message without listening to the end. There was no error, no mistake, just consequences Michael had never anticipated because he had never believed he would have to face any. 3 months in, Michael tried to sell the house. The attorney called me to tell me the listing had gone up, priced to move quickly, advertised as prime real estate. The desperation was subtle, but it was there. "He'll trigger the forfeiture clause," the attorney said. "I know," I replied. "The property will revert to you." "I know. Do you want me to inform him before he proceeds?" I thought about it, really thought about it. About the boy who had worked 3 jobs, about the son who had drained his savings,
about the brother who had been invisible for most of his life. "No," I said quietly. "Let him learn." The sale collapsed almost immediately. The buyer's attorney flagged the conditional clauses during the title search: the 5-year requirement, the assumed debts, the forfeiture terms. Michael's realtor called him with the news, and for the first time in his entitled life, Michael realized he had been outplayed. Not by me, by our father, by the man who loved him enough to give him everything he asked for, and wise enough to ensure that it destroyed him.
Michael showed up at my apartment 4 months after he had evicted me from our childhood home. He looked different, thinner, tired. The effortless confidence he once wore so easily had been replaced by something brittle, something that cracked the moment our eyes met. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Daniel," he said, my name careful in his mouth now, uncertain. "Michael? I need to talk to you about the will. Have you read page 5? He flinched. "I did, finally. But there has to be a way to fix this. We can work something out. You can help me with these bills. We can split everything." "No," I said, calmly. "Daniel, please. I'm drowning. The medical bills alone are more than the house is worth," you finished for him. "Yes, I know. I paid them." His face went pale. "You... what?" "I paid every single one," I said. "While you were in Europe. While you were finding yourself. While Dad was dying and I was the only one there. Then why are they coming after me now?" he asked, his voice shaking. I smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Because our father transferred the liability to you when he transferred the house. The debts I paid were the debts to keep Dad comfortable. The debts you're facing are the legal obligations tied to the inheritance you were so eager to claim." Michael's hands trembled. "This isn't fair." And there it was, the sentence that defined him. "Fair?" I repeated softly. "You locked me out of my childhood home with 1 hour's notice. You celebrated getting everything while I got nothing. You built your entire life on the belief that being loved more meant you deserved more." I stepped closer, close enough that he had to look at me. "Dad didn't leave you the inheritance because he loved you more, Michael. He left it to you because he knew exactly who you were, and he wanted you to finally understand what it costs to take things you haven't earned." "I can't afford this," Michael whispered. "I'll lose everything." "I know," I said. "You have to help me." "No, Michael, I really don't." He stood there for a moment longer, searching my face for something I wasn't willing to give him. Then he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, the weight of his choices finally settling in.
Michael tried to fight it. He hired lawyers, contested the will, and argued that the conditions were unfair and punitive. But our father had been thorough. Every clause was legal, every condition enforceable. Every trap Michael had walked into was one he had sprung himself through his own arrogance. 6 months after our father's death, Michael forfeited the house. He couldn't maintain the payments. He couldn't cover the debts. He couldn't meet the conditions he had never bothered to read. The property reverted to me, exactly as the forfeiture clause specified. The medical debt liability reverted as well, but the collections agencies quickly discovered that I had already settled those accounts. The documentation was flawless. The payments traced directly back to my accounts, which meant that Michael's assumption of liability was for debts that no longer existed.
Legally, that debt belonged to him. Our father had planned it all, every layer, every contingency. He had given Michael enough rope to hang himself and ensure that every knot was tied by Michael's own hands. I moved back into the house on a cold afternoon in late autumn. The rooms felt different now, smaller somehow, quieter, less haunted. Michael's celebration party left stains on the hardwood floors and damage he never bothered to repair because he had always assumed he would sell the house and move on to something better. I hired contractors, painted the walls, replaced what was broken. Slowly, room by room, I erased the evidence of Michael's brief ownership and made the house mine in ways it had never been before. 8 months after our father's death, the investment accounts were released to me. The trust documentation I had maintained, every receipt, every transfer, every hour I had spent caring for Dad, was examined and verified. Michael's lawyer argued that emotional labor couldn't be monetized. My lawyer presented the second mortgage on my apartment, the itemized medical payments, the in-home care expenses, and the financial sacrifices that had kept our father comfortable in his final years. The ruling was clear. The funds were dispersed to me in full. I saw Michael one last time by accident, months later, at a coffee shop downtown. He was sitting alone, staring at a laptop screen, wearing clothes I recognized from years ago. He looked up when he saw me. "You got everything," he said, quietly. "I got what I earned," I replied. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad really hated me, didn't he?" I thought about that for a long moment. "No," I said. "I think he loved you enough to finally teach you something." "And what's that?" "That charm isn't character, that entitlement isn't inheritance, that taking something doesn't make it yours." Michael didn't argue. He just nodded, smaller somehow, diminished by the truth. I left him there and walked away without triumph or anger. Today I still live in our father's house. The coffee mug he used that final morning sits on a shelf in my office. His reading glasses rest in a drawer I open sometimes when I need to remember. People ask me if I feel guilty, if I wish I had warned Michael, if I regret letting him walk into the trap our father set. I think about the boy I was at 10, the young man I was at 20, and the son I was at 30. And I think about the moment Michael gave me 1 hour to leave my childhood home. No, I don't feel guilty. Page 5 was never about revenge. It was about justice. One detail, one page, one clause Michael never believed mattered. That single detail cost him everything he thought he'd won and gave me back everything I had already earned. He forgot one detail because he never believed details mattered.